There is something I didn't see for a long time, and it was quietly shaping how I lived. At some point, I began to notice something in myself, a kind of quiet tension, a constant underlying effort to stay safe. And I realized I didn't know what I didn't know. And I had been walking through life, not really aware of my deeper fears and concerns, all of which were, in a way, completely understandable. For me, it goes back to when I was about 5 years old. My brother was born, and all of a sudden, the attention of my mother moved toward him. And of course, as a 5 year old, I didn't understand that. And somewhere inside, it became something like, I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. And I think, once I began to see my own patterns, and more than anything, the way that they had impacted my life, not like I lived a terrible life, but it was just exhausting. It's exhausting when you're walking around trying to constantly protect yourself or avoid worst case scenarios. Or, as I often say, most people are trying to avoid a bad future that hasn't happened yet. And when you begin to see this, you start to understand why we reach for things to take the edge off. Because the same human brain is projecting a worst case scenario, typically of a future. And then the brain that created that imagined it, is now trying to do everything to avoid it, forgetting that it made it up. So it's all largely unconscious. But the brain, designed to predict and protect, is projecting, typically as a reflection of past hurt. So again, I say, past hurt informs future fear. We all have been through trials and tribulations, disappointments, failures, heartbreak. And so the brain then amasses all of this, accumulates the evidence for why we should be concerned about a future that might replicate that. So you're imagining typically worst case scenarios, which we call the future, but it's completely fictitious. You're never in the future. It's just a thought happening now. But then when we go really deep, so when is the future happening? Now. But it's a projection of something you think could happen. So the same brain that's been imagining that is now, because of the concern, which creates an emotional reaction, typically anxiety, fear, worry, or anticipation, is now thinking, okay, how do I avoid that from happening? Forgetting that it created the potential in the first place. And then you begin to understand why people are exhausted and a bit lost in it. So for me, when I saw that whole matrix, the madness of the subconscious mind, what it means to be human, and how we're constantly trying to survive, it was actually a relief. I thought, why would I keep putting myself through that? Through something that, in a way, feels like self torture. Because that's really what limitations are. That's what they lead to, the perception of limitation. So, the way I've refined my work now is really distinguishing between two distinct ways of living. The first is the world we're born into. It can almost feel like a kind of invisible confinement that everyone enters just by the virtue of being human. You arrive at this kind of pure potential, but very quickly you're confined by subconscious narratives like, I'm not good enough, I'm not loved, I'm not safe, I'm not wanted. Whatever it is, it's usually some form of self negation. And then you go about your life, and sometimes you get triggered enough to begin to see that these may not actually be true, and something begins to loosen. But most people don't, because now we have all these different ways to distract or move away from what feels uncomfortable. So we arrive as pure potential looking through a lens of constraint. That's limitation. And that creates a predominant emotion of fear, which is exactly what most people live in. That then becomes the overarching experience of suffering. And suffering, the cascade of the nervous system into the body, eventually shows up as disease, the absence of ease, which then manifests in relationships as dysfunction and disharmony, and in work and finances as scarcity and lack. That's the system we have. And then do your best, get by, good luck. And if you have resources, maybe you can make your discomfort a little bit more comfortable. You can package suffering differently. But the guy downstairs in the bar smoking and drinking is not that different from the guy smoking a cigar and drinking champagne. Just the means of escape is more expensive, packaged a little differently. And so that's one world. That's the default. And what I'm really passionate about in my work is pointing to a completely different paradigm. Not improving the one we are in, but stepping into something entirely different. Like Buckminster Fuller said, you don't change things by trying to fight the existing reality. To make real change, you create a new model that makes the old one obsolete. So rather than trying to improve people's lives, I point toward a different way of being, where, in the absence of limitation, there is a sense of freedom. And from that, instead of fear, there can be a sense of joy and love. Instead of suffering, a sense of possibility. Instead of disease, vitality. Instead of dysfunction, connection and intimacy. Instead of scarcity, a sense of abundance. And last I checked, that feels like a very different way to live.